You'll see there's a logo at the top called Your Holiday Hub. And the very first thing we did was change the name of the programme. It's a Bristol thing. So the partnership I mentioned is across the voluntary and community sector through something called Playful Bristol. Also Feeding Bristol, which does a lot of work around the strategy around hunger and food equity across Bristol. Fair Share and Band Bristol Association for Neighbourhood Daycare that I mentioned earlier, and also the council. So we're part of that broader partnership. We've got a really mixed picture of deprivation across Bristol, ranging from some really highly affluent areas to some wards who are in the top 1% of deprivation in the country. So a really mixed picture. So Playful Bristol is a group of 10 organisations who came together a couple of years ago to really champion and advocate for play. So when the council heard that they had this money coming in, they already had people they could phone, people they could call. And the beauty of that approach is about really combining each sector's knowledge into a really clear and coherent whole picture of needs, assets and provision across Bristol. And with that strength of understanding comes the ability to reach really tiny organisations, right through to much larger organisations, sports clubs, schools, the registered holiday providers. Easter was pretty bonkers, I would say, with the amount of time we had. We were also in a more restricted time in terms of COVID. So again, we took the approach around combining activity packs with food and doing much smaller targeted sessions up to the levels that the restrictions allowed. There were 40 organisations, over 400 activities that reached nearly 4,000 children and young people, and we pulled the voluntary sector partnership behind that together in about 48 hours. But we approached it by having locality-based meetings, presenting the key information about the programme, able to take questions, hear what people wanted to know. We then did a round of expressions of interest, and that was about really gauging capacity in the sector and what was out there. And the council were absolutely brilliant with this, because what they did was they put that onto a Google form that people filled in, which meant it was generating spreadsheets out the other end that could then tell us, right, we've got this much provision in this area, but we've got gaps here, we've got overlap here. And that meant that we could then go back to organisations with follow-up calls, follow-up meetings around, okay, how can we piece all that together? So yeah, the summer we've really sort of taken that bit extra time and approach around it. I think one of the really key things for us has been about sustaining what already exists. You know, everybody's had a hard time over COVID, and actually we're really seeing this as it's not just a short-term project, it is about sustaining that sector. We also had a real principle around keeping it local and working with existing organisations, partly because of the sustainability stuff I've just talked about, but also because they have the pre-existing relationships with families and children and young people. The council had a real underlying principle around light touch commissioning. I think really bluntly, the 4 hours, 4 days, 4 weeks wasn't particularly helpful, because that's not always how children, young people, families and organisations work. So what we did was, rather than say, can you do 4 hours, 4 days, 4 weeks, we asked what people could do. And we then matched people up, we paired up provision so that we absolutely meet the requirements of the fund, but it does it in a way that's real on the ground for the sector and for children and young people. We complemented ours also with a really strong training resource. We've also done quite a bit of work with other local funders to try and encourage moving funding around where possible, which has been a way that we've then been able to ensure that half terms are funded. You've got to have trust between sectors, and we've absolutely got that in Bristol. You've got to have innovative commissioning. You've got to have people who are really prepared in the council to understand how the sector's working, and that's worked very well in Bristol. Our adventure playgrounds, I think, have been a real backbone of a lot of our provision. And my last slide is an invitation to stay in touch. My email is there, but if you've got specific questions for any other part of the partnership, just drop me a line, and I'll make sure that I put you in touch with the right people.
I know you mentioned the 444 as being something that hadn't worked that well for your local providers. Is there anything, well, you could say more about that, or is there anything else that you would like to see change in order for it to run more smoothly as we go forward?
I think that the 444 thing was tricky, partly because I just think that children and young people don't work like that. Children, younger children don't necessarily want to do the same thing solidly for 4 hours. Older children, teenagers are going to come along, check it out and see if it's worth staying. And I think also, it's not long enough to be childcare in terms of, the working day. So I think I'd like to understand perhaps a bit more behind why it's like that.
My experience of running a holiday play scheme is that the half terms are in high demand for, for holiday care, and Christmas, for example, is possibly less likely to have such a high demand. So we have made a request that wasn't successful at this point to the DfE for half terms to be considered at our discretion with the funding. That would be useful going forward. And also the flexibility of eligibility, really. We've got a number of children who are siblings in a family who are transitioning from early years to school provision, who aren't eligible technically to have this funding because they're not receiving free school meals at that point, but they will do in a month's time, potentially. So a little bit more flexibility, and I know there is some built into the scheme that we can request, but a little bit more flexibility would be useful.
And it's an obvious point, but the knowing about it and being able to plan for funding in a complex funding world, I think if this does become a part of a standard offer and a standard funding offer over the next few years, that would be tremendous, because that would allow you to kind of look at the whole funding picture, particularly for the VCSE, and think about, and we kind of do it on a piecemeal basis and move funding around and things, but being able to look at that as a holistic picture, because at the moment we've got a skewed investment towards 10 weeks of the year, and partners struggle year round and poverty doesn't go anywhere.
Alison, I just noticed in your presentation that you were offering to hear and support any struggles from providers as they started to think about how they would deliver the programme, and I wondered if you'd had any feedback on that.
Sometimes it's issues with working with, for example, schools on school sites, and especially in the summer holidays, it's potential issues with schools having building work done, etc. Some of the issues are understanding the food offer and being petrified of school food standards, and us trying to unpick that with them. And
I think one of the other issues, and it's been kind of touched on really, is the whole staffing issue, because what people tend to do is they go, yeah, we can do that, and then suddenly you've got adverts going out across the city for hundreds of play workers and youth workers, and they're just not there. And if they're not, if it's not invested in across the whole year, then they're never going to be. And there's something about being able to recruit people that you can then train, support, retain, and hopefully they then see play and youth workers as a really valuable profession. I think some of the I think the training offer was really important. I think people start to think Ofsted safeguarding, but I think also there's something for me about it's enabled people to see how professional the sector is, because there were quite a few people, and I will say within the local authority, who were like, well, who are these people? Mm-hmm. And we're like, well, actually, they're community organisations who've been around for years and years and years. most of whom you're already actually funding to some degree to do something. And what they don't know about safeguarding and Ofsted registration and food hygiene and all the rest of it isn't worth knowing.
I think there's some still nervousness around opening up of services as a following COVID, so particularly access to large venues for them to manage, kind of offering really good provision in the with the Manchester climate of constant rain. So there's been the kind of exploration of working with schools in particular for that. A little bit of concern around physical activity guidelines, and people worried that they had to put on PE lessons, reminding colleagues that players oftentimes physical, and running around on the adventure playground is definitely definitely meets physical activity guidelines, and you don't have to run football sessions. So,
and I wondered what some of the conversations you had internally in the local authority. I'm sure you can't share them all, but I imagine it's a slightly different approach to how commissioning was happening before.
So for Easter, we opted for a 50% payment in advance for booked places again, and then 50% post holiday scheme. However, that logistically was a real challenge, and we've needed to find capacity for this scheme, as everyone else has, out of or from very busy people already. And so to make it as simple as possible, we opted for the 100% payment, and we will review that after the summer holidays. It's a shame when families don't arrive, because obviously the children aren't getting that enriched experience, but also that's a place that could have gone for someone else. So we have encouraged providers, as part of usual practice in terms of safeguarding, to phone on the day of no show, but we can't force parents to arrive. So that's a sort of a problem sort of hanging there in terms of what's that going to look like in the summer holidays for maybe those families that booked this week and perhaps forget about it come summer holidays. Hopefully providers will remind them that they have these places booked, but it's really important that we try and get as high a attendance rate as possible. But yeah, that's one of our hanging challenges really.
If you're going to put a session in place, you have all the costs of rent, of insurance, of staffing, of having trained those staff. Those costs are there and they have to be met. And so actually the energy goes into making sure that the opportunities are promoted so people do show up. I think we're also working with organisations who know their families so well that actually that kind of word of mouth of when you see people, you mention it. I think some of the communication methods about what's happening haven't been the sort of traditional, here's a flyer on the local notice board. It is actually really getting the message out and filling those places. But certainly Bristol Council just took the view, well, if we don't fund in advance, people won't have the money to do it, in which case that's going to create another whole set of problems.
Thank you so much. I think it's been really, really interesting and just brilliant. And I think the communication needs to continue, and sharing good practice will continue. Play England will continue to do webinars, and we will send out the slideshows and any other information that we've received through this webinar to all of the Play England members. I need to double check whether we can just send it to you because you signed up. I'm not sure we can. So feel free to become a member, which is free and just means that we're allowed to send you stuff